The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Chicago's Palmer House Hotel conference room on that gray October afternoon in 1974, where Muhammad Ali sat behind a long table draped in white cloth, flanked by his team, facing a room packed with reporters who had come to witness what they thought would be just another routine press conference before his upcoming fight. But what they didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary gathering would transform into one of the most legendary verbal battles in sports journalism history, a moment that would be replayed and quoted for decades to come, all because one arrogant reporter decided to test the greatest of all time with a question so dismissive, so condescending, that it would spark a response nobody in that room could have anticipated. Ali had just returned from Zaire, where he'd stunned the world by defeating George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle, reclaiming his heavyweight championship title at age 32, proving all the doubters wrong who said he was washed up, too old, finished. But as he sat there in his sharp three-piece suit, tie perfectly knotted, his face still showing the subtle marks of battle, he exuded a calm confidence that somehow made the room both comfortable and electric at the same time. A presence so magnetic that even the most cynical journalists found themselves leaning forward in their seats, pens ready, tape recorders rolling, cameras clicking, all waiting to capture whatever magic might emerge from the mouth of the man who had once proclaimed himself the prettiest thing that ever lived. The questions started predictably enough: inquiries about training regimens, fight strategies, weight management, upcoming opponents. The usual sports journalism fodder that Ali handled with his characteristic mix of humor and insight. But then, about 45 minutes into the session, a hand shot up from the back row, belonging to a reporter named Richard Brennan, a veteran sports columnist from a major New York newspaper who had built his reputation on tough questions and tougher opinions, a man known in journalism circles for his no-nonsense approach and his belief that athletes, even champions, needed to be kept in their proper place, reminded that they were merely entertainers, not intellectuals, not leaders, certainly not philosophers, just men who got paid to hit each other for the amusement of the masses. "Mr. Ali?" Brennan's voice cut through the room with a sharp edge that immediately changed the atmosphere, causing several other reporters to exchange knowing glances because they recognized that tone, that particular blend of condescension and challenge that Brennan was famous for. "I've been covering boxing for 23 years, and I've interviewed every champion from Joe Louis to Rocky Marciano, and I have to ask you something that's been bothering me and many of my colleagues." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence build, enjoying the attention as all eyes turned to him. "Why do you insist on speaking about politics, religion, social issues, international affairs, as if your opinion matters more than anyone else's? At the end of the day, you're just a boxer, a man who hits people for a living. So why should anyone care what you think about Vietnam, or civil rights, or world poverty? Shouldn't you just stick to what you know, which is punching people in the face?" The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, almost suffocating, as if all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out through the windows, and you could literally hear the rain against the glass, the distant hum of traffic on the streets below, the nervous shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats, because even the reporters who sometimes felt frustrated by Ali's outspokenness, even those who had written critical columns about his political stances, recognized that Brennan had just crossed a line, had reduced a man who had sacrificed his championship titles, had faced prison time, had been stripped of his license and his livelihood for 3.5 years during his prime, because he refused to fight in a war he believed was wrong, had reduced all of that courage and conviction to nothing more than just a boxer. Two words that seemed designed not to question, but to diminish, not to challenge, but to insult. Ali didn't react immediately, and that pause, those few seconds before he responded, felt like an eternity to everyone in that room, because they knew Ali, knew his quick wit, his lightning-fast comebacks, his ability to verbally dance around opponents just as gracefully as he danced around them in the ring. But this time, he just sat there, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his eyes fixed on Brennan with an intensity that made the reporter visibly shift in his seat, and then slowly, deliberately, Ali leaned forward into the microphone, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't raised, wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, but instead carried a weight, a gravity, a depth that commanded every person in that room to listen, not just with their ears, but with their souls. "Just a boxer," Ali repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Brother Richard, do you mind if I call you Richard?" He didn't wait for an answer. "You said you've been covering boxing for 23 years, interviewed all the champions, and yet you still don't understand what a boxer really is, what a fighter really does, and that tells me you've been watching but not seeing, listening but not hearing, writing but not understanding. So let me educate you, not because I think I'm smarter than you, but because maybe nobody ever took the time to explain it to you properly." The other reporters in the room began scribbling frantically, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. This wasn't going to be a typical Ali boast or a clever rhyme. This was going to be something different, something profound, and they could feel it in the way he spoke, the deliberate pace of his words, the careful construction of his thoughts. "You see, Richard, when you say I'm just a boxer, you're looking at me and seeing only these hands." Ali raised his fists. "These hands that have thrown thousands of punches, that have won championships, that have knocked men unconscious. And yes, you're right, these hands hit people. That's what they do in the ring. But these hands have also held my babies when they were born, have wiped tears from my mother's eyes, have reached into my pocket to give money to people on the street who needed it more than I did, have been raised in prayer 5 times a day since I accepted Islam, have signed autographs for children who see me as more than just a boxer, have shaken hands with presidents and kings and the poorest people in the world, and every single one of those handshakes meant something, carried meaning beyond just flesh touching flesh." He paused, letting that sink in, watching as Brennan's confident smirk began to fade slightly, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. And Ali continued, his voice growing stronger, more passionate, but never angry, never vindictive, because this wasn't about winning an argument. This was about teaching a lesson, about opening eyes that had been closed for too long. "You mentioned Joe Louis, said you interviewed him, and Joe was a great champion, maybe the greatest heavyweight before me, and yes, he was a boxer, but do you know what Joe Louis meant to black people in America in 1938 when he fought Max Schmeling? Do you know that when Joe knocked out Schmeling, it wasn't just a boxing match, it was Black America defeating Nazi Germany. It was proof that we were equal, that we could compete, that we could win, that we could be champions in a country that treated us like we were less than human." Ali's voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in intensity. "Joe Louis was never just a boxer, Richard. He was a symbol, a beacon, a hope. And when he won, millions of people who never threw a punch in their lives felt like they had won too. Felt like maybe, just maybe, this country might one day treat them fairly." The room was absolutely transfixed now. Some reporters had stopped taking notes, just listening, watching, experiencing this moment that was rapidly becoming something more than a press conference, something more like a sermon, a teaching, a revelation, and Ali was just getting started, his rhythm building, his words flowing like poetry, like music, like truth spoken with such clarity that it couldn't be ignored or dismissed. "You asked why people should care about my opinion on Vietnam, on civil rights, on social issues, and you know what, Richard? You're right to ask that question, but you're asking the wrong person. Don't ask me why people care what I think. Ask yourself why you don't care what I think. Ask yourself why a man who has traveled to more countries than most politicians, who has met with world leaders and scholars and religious teachers, who has read history and philosophy and studied the struggles of oppressed people around the world. Ask yourself why you think that man's opinion is worth less than yours simply because he makes his living in a boxing ring instead of behind a typewriter." That last line landed like a punch, sharp and precise, and you could see it register on Brennan's face, see him realize that he was no longer controlling this exchange, that he had poked a bear and the bear wasn't angry, wasn't going to maul him, but was instead going to show him just how small his thinking had been, how limited his perspective, how narrow his understanding of what it meant to be a human being in this complicated world. Let me tell you something about being just a boxer, Richard, and I want you to really hear this, really understand it. Ali leaned even further forward, his eyes never leaving Brennan's face. A boxer steps into a ring knowing he might get hurt, might get knocked out, might suffer brain damage, might even die, and he does it anyway. Why? Because he's hungry, because he needs to feed his family, because boxing is his way out of poverty, out of the ghetto, out of a life with no opportunities, no chances, no hope. And so he trains, he sacrifices, he bleeds, he pushes his body beyond what should be humanly possible. And he does all of this knowing that society looks down on him, calls him a brute, a savage, entertainment for the rich people in the expensive seats who would never invite him to dinner, who would never let him date their daughters, who would never consider him their equal. And yet he fights anyway, because fighting is all he has. Fighting is his voice. Fighting is his way of saying, I matter, I exist, I am somebody. The passion in Ali's voice was building now, his hands gesturing, his entire body engaged in the act of communication, and every person in that room could feel it, could feel the truth of what he was saying, could feel the weight of a lifetime of fighting, not just in rings but in courtrooms, in the court of public opinion, in the struggle for basic human dignity and respect. When I refused to go to Vietnam, Richard, when I said, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong, do you know what happened? Ali didn't wait for an answer. They stripped me of my title. They took away my license. They banned me from boxing in every state in this country. They tried to send me to prison for 5 years. They vilified me in newspapers like yours, called me a traitor, a coward, a draft dodger. And you know what the funny thing is? I was willing to fight. I've been fighting my whole life. I just wanted to know why I should go 10,000 miles away to drop bombs on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs, can't eat in certain restaurants, can't stay in certain hotels, can't vote without being threatened or killed. Tell me, Richard, who's the real enemy? The Vietnamese rice farmer who never called me the N-word, or the white American who won't let me live in his neighborhood? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Not just to Brennan, but to everyone in that room, to everyone in America, to everyone who had ever dismissed Ali as just an entertainer, just an athlete, just someone who should shut up and fight. You see, brother, and I call you brother because we're all brothers and sisters in humanity, whether we recognize it or not, you see. When you reduce someone to just anything, you're not just insulting them, you're limiting your own understanding of the world. You're building walls in your mind that prevent you from seeing the full picture, from understanding the complexity of human experience, from recognizing that every single person you meet, no matter what they do for a living, has a story, has wisdom, has something to teach you if you're humble enough to learn. Ali's voice softened slightly, the edge of confrontation giving way to something more compassionate, more teaching than fighting. I'm not angry at you for that question, Richard. Honestly, I'm not, because you're not the first person to think that way, and you won't be the last. This whole society is built on putting people in boxes, on saying you're just this or you're just that, on making sure everyone stays in their lane, knows their place, doesn't get too big for their britches. But here's what I learned. Here's what being a boxer taught me. In the ring, all that matters is what's inside you, not your title, not your reputation, not what people say about you, but what you're willing to do when you're tired, when you're hurt, when everyone expects you to quit, when it would be easier to just stay down. That's when you find out who you really are. And that lesson applies to everything in life, not just boxing. Have you ever stood up for what's right, even when it cost you everything? That's what Ali was asking, not just Brennan, but everyone in that room, everyone who would later read about this moment, everyone who would watch the clips on television. And the power of that question was that it forced introspection, forced people to examine their own courage, their own convictions, their own willingness to sacrifice comfort for principle. And as Ali continued speaking, you could see the transformation happening in real time, could see Brennan's defensive posture beginning to crack, his arms uncrossing, his expression shifting from confrontational to contemplative, because this wasn't a verbal beating, this was an education, and even the most stubborn student can learn when the teacher speaks with enough wisdom and compassion. Let me tell you about the reporters I respect, Richard, and maybe you can learn something from them. Allie's tone became almost gentle now, like a father teaching a son. The reporters I respect are the ones who ask tough questions, yes, but they ask them because they want to understand, not because they want to prove someone wrong or put someone in their place. They're curious, they're open-minded, they recognize that a 15-minute interview is a privilege, a chance to learn something new, to gain insight, to maybe see the world from a perspective different from their own. And when they write their articles, they don't just report what was said, they report what was meant. They capture the humanity of the moment. They help their readers understand not just the facts, but the context, the emotions, the deeper truth beneath the surface. But the real shock was yet to come, because what Allie said next would be quoted in journalism schools for generations, would be written about in books and dissertaries, would become one of those moments that defined not just a man, but an era. And it came when Brennan, clearly affected by what he'd been hearing, clearly wrestling with his own assumptions and biases, asked in a much quieter voice, "Mr. Ali, if you're not just a boxer, then what are you?" And Ali smiled, not a mocking smile, not a triumphant smile, but a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes and seemed to light up the entire room, and he said, "Brother Richard, I'm the same thing you are. I'm the same thing every person in this room is. I'm the same thing as the janitor who cleaned this conference room this morning, and the CEO of this hotel, and the homeless man on the corner outside, and the President of the United States. I'm a human being, created by God, placed on this earth for a purpose, blessed with talents and cursed with weaknesses, trying to figure out how to use the time I've been given to make a difference, to leave the world a little bit better than I found it. To stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, to speak truth even when it's unpopular, to love even when it's difficult. And yes, part of how I do that is through boxing, through using the platform that boxing has given me, through being so good at what I do that people have no choice but to pay attention. And then when they're paying attention, when they're watching, when they're listening, I try to say something worth hearing. Something that might change a mind, might open a heart, might inspire someone to be better, to do better, to demand better from themselves and their society. The room erupted in applause, spontaneous and genuine. Reporters who had come looking for sound bites found themselves clapping for a speech they hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for, hadn't seen coming. And even Brennan was clapping, slowly at first, then more vigorously. And when the applause died down, he stood up, this veteran reporter who had started the conference with such arrogance, such certainty, that he knew better. And he said something that shocked everyone in the room even more than Ali's speech had. He said, "Mr. Ali, I owe you an apology. I came here today with prejudice, with preconceptions, with a closed mind, and you just opened it. You're right. You're absolutely right. You're not just a boxer. You never were. And I'm ashamed that it took me 23 years of covering this sport to understand that I'm going to write about this conversation, but not in the way I planned to. Not as another critical column about an athlete who doesn't know his place, but as a confession. A recognition that maybe the person who doesn't know his place is me. Maybe I'm the one who needs to expand my thinking, my understanding, my appreciation for the complexity and dignity of every human being, regardless of what they do for a living." The humility in Brennan's voice was palpable, genuine, the kind of transformation that you rarely see in public, especially from someone who had built his reputation on being tough and uncompromising. And Ali stood up, walked around the table, and extended his hand to Brennan. And when they shook hands, it wasn't just two men reconciling, it was a symbol of what could happen when people chose dialogue over dismissiveness. When they chose to see each other's humanity rather than just their differences, when they chose to learn rather than just defend their existing beliefs. What happened in that Chicago hotel conference room on that rainy October afternoon wasn't just a press conference. It was a masterclass in communication, in dignity, in the power of words to transform hearts and minds, and in the years that followed, Brennan would write about that day many times, would describe it as the moment that changed his career, changed his approach to journalism, changed his understanding of what it meant to be truly professional, which wasn't about being tough or critical or maintaining distance, but about being open, being curious, being willing to admit when you're wrong and learn from people you might have previously dismissed. And he and Ali maintained a friendship until Ali's death in 2016, with Brennan becoming one of the most eloquent writers about Ali's legacy, about his importance not just to boxing, but to American history, to the civil rights movement, to the anti-war movement, to the ongoing struggle for human dignity and equality that continues to this day. The other reporters in that room never forgot what they witnessed either, many of them later describing it as one of the most powerful moments they'd experienced in their careers. A reminder that sometimes the best stories aren't the ones you plan to write, but the ones that happen when you're open to being surprised, to being challenged, to being changed, and that the people we label as just anything, just an athlete, just a worker, just a whatever, are always more complex, more valuable, more worthy of respect than our limited labels suggest. And if we're wise enough, humble enough, open enough to really listen to them, really see them, really understand them, they just might teach us something that changes our lives forever, just like Muhammad Ali did that day, not with his fists, but with his words, his wisdom, his unwavering belief in the fundamental dignity of every human being, and his refusal to be reduced to anything less than the complex, brilliant, flawed, magnificent human being that he was, because Muhammad Ali was never just a boxer. He was a teacher, a prophet, a warrior for justice, a voice for the voiceless, a champion in every sense of that word. And the world is better because he refused to stay in the box that society tried to put him in, because he insisted on being fully, completely, unapologetically himself. And in doing so, he gave permission to millions of others to do the same, to be more than their job titles, more than their circumstances, more than what others expected or demanded, to be human beings in the fullest, richest, most beautiful sense of that word.